This book is like challenging me with, I always have to like look up the pronunciation, and then it just makes you think like you could go down a rabbit hole of like one little thing that they cite and you could read for 2 more hours and be like, oh, wow.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the hook!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Well, welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You Book Club. We are continuing our journey with The Dawn of Everything. This week we're talking about Chapter 8, which is called Imaginary Cities, Eurasia's First Urbanites in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Ukraine, and China, and how they built cities without kings. On par with the opening line of this chapter, which says, cities begin in the mind, I just wanted to start with a question abstractly for us to riff on for a minute. What makes a city a city? Any thoughts you guys have abstractly? Any initial takes about the chapter that lead to this question? Any thoughts at all about what makes a city a city?
Brittany and I were actually just having this conversation the other day because, like, the town that we live in, it's like the village of Saranac Lake is made up of like 4 different towns, which all contribute to this one village. And then some of the towns themselves are smaller than the village. So like we're having this back and forth on like what actually constitutes a town versus like a hamlet versus like and how that works. And I think what it came down to is, at least in modern times, it's just population size is pretty much the biggest thing that determine that. But then also in like the US, we don't actually use the same like scale or whatnot that they do in like England when it comes to like actually adhering to what a hamlet is versus a town versus like a village and stuff like that. Like, so we just kind of like label shit whatever we want to in the US. But I guess like that still holds for me. Like I would think like a city would be like a certain population size or something. Like, have been my initial like what makes a city. Like I would think that, and then maybe certain services being available. Like I would usually think like, you know, you need like a hospital or some form of mass transit availability. Like I'm just thinking modern day, you know, it's kind of like where my head goes when I think about what's a city.
Yeah, Eugene doesn't have any hospitals. We actually got rid of our hospitals, and the closest hospital is like in Springfield, and there were 2, and we just closed another one of them. So cities don't need hospitals. Yeah, it's pretty depressing. Yeah, I thought the same thing, like population too, but then I thought like, where does that line get drawn? Like 5 people, 500, 501, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, totally. Like, I don't know. I thought services too. That's a great question and really hard to define that beyond population. I don't know.
Yeah, when I was growing up, one of the towns I lived in had 2,000 people in it. It was technically a city. It was called the City of Chesney. They had like, still have probably the government and everything in the city. But then there was a town nearby, Boiling Springs, that was way bigger than we were, had like several thousand people. They were not a city. It was like explicitly not a city. They didn't have like an official city hall or anything like that. So it's sort of in the modern era about government too. Just what bureaucracies are set. Is there a police force in that little area that protects and serves that little area? Population, I feel like, legally anyway, doesn't really get at it. You can have a small thing that's a city and a bigger thing that's a town or a village, so it's kind of arbitrary how we label it. But I think in people's sense, it does have something to do with this scale, which is what they're getting at in the chapter. But I really liked what you said, Kodie, about the services thing. I think that's getting at something more useful in the definition of a city. Is there some sort of communal activity that all the people in the city benefit from, participate in, are obligated to in some way or form? I don't know. I thought that was an interesting way to look at it, as services.
Yeah, there's like a social, I mean, I know they use the term like social experiment or something, but I was going to say there's like some implied social, you know, you're like just, I lack the words.
Yeah, everybody's doing something together, right? Like they got something going on together.
Yeah, there's like consent, I guess, to give away your power maybe.
Consent is a That's a good concept to think about with this. Yeah, I was just gonna say, no hospital, absolutely not a city. Doesn't count. Got to have a hospital.
I think we should take all hospitals out of every city.
Yeah. Telehealth, it's totally fine for healthcare, but if you got to work, it has to be in person. But otherwise it's fine.
There should be like we're gonna start the first telehealth emergency room.
They already do that for deaf people, like just the cheap way. If a deaf person goes to a hospital, a lot of hospitals will partner with some contractor that does virtual relay interpreters, and they'll just pull up an iPad with an interpreter and just give this deaf person, which is technically access, but it's really shitty access. It depends on internet. You get a random person who doesn't work at the hospital. They're just in a call center, and it's just kind of a communication access nightmare. So deaf people in general would prefer there to be real live people, interpreters at the hospital that they can use when they show up. But a lot of hospitals take the cheap way out and just hire some video relay service or whatever. But yeah, all these messy questions go into defining what it means when we say we live in a city or when we live in civilization. I don't know. I feel like those conversations kind of get conflated in an abstract way. What is a city? What is a civilization? They're sort of similar conversations in a lot of ways. But with this chapter, what these authors are talking about is an extension and elaboration of their argument that they've been making throughout the book, which in general is that large urban civilization does not necessarily lead to hierarchy or kings, although it can. Even if it does happen, it isn't necessarily permanent, and that people scale up their civilizations in many different ways, and they sort of enumerate all the different ways that looks like. So I thought, starting at the end, just to clarify their argument about the chapter, we could talk about this quote on page 322, where they just state at the bottom of this section, they say, in short, archaeological research has shifted the burden of proof onto those theorists who claim causal connections between the origins of cities and the rise of stratified states, and whose claims now look increasingly hollow. So in this chapter, they look at civilizations in some ancient sites in Ukraine and Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, and in China. After looking at all those different things, they conclude that the modern archaeological evidence shows conclusively that a city does not necessarily imply a hierarchy or an aristocracy or some sort of king-like structure. And so that assumption, in the way we talk about history, the burden of proof is shifted onto those people who make that claim. You have to be able to demonstrate that and claim that. And there's increasingly more and more evidence that that's not always the case. It often looks very different. And in some of these, it's like the city happened first, and then the aristocracy or the stratification was a response to the initial city popping up. I don't know, they especially harped on that point when it came to ancient Samaria and Mesopotamian civilizations. But yeah, this issue of what is a city? What does it mean? Is it just a large amount of people in one place? Is that all it means?
I just wanted to respond to one thing you said there earlier, Joe. You were just talking about their main point, and what I thought was worth mentioning again or highlighting was just like, that traditional story like you talked about where cities develop and hierarchy automatically develops because of that, or like those two things are intertwined. And the burden of proof piece kind of goes on to the people that claim that that's always a thing, right? And which I thought was really a good way of pointing that out here. Like, they don't need to go and prove like all of these cities didn't necessarily have hierarchy, right? It was just like, they only really need to show that like one, like if the argument is like this always happens, right? So I just thought that was a really good way to kind of frame it and think about it, right? Because I keep getting caught in the trap of like, well, thinking to the original story and there's so much evidence of like this happening that's true, but it's like all the things that they're kind of pointing at in previous chapters of like those type of societies have a lot more artifacts and whatnot. It was just really helpful for me to kind of think about that, and like they don't need to prove every single city. It's just like one or two of these examples can take that argument apart kind of.
Yeah, totally. And even with any of the examples that we think of, like I don't know if they get into Egypt much in this book, but ancient Samaria is often like the example people point to as like the first modern civilization or whatever. And what I like that they do with how they go through the archaeological evidence and everything is they'll point out some of these famous examples, and then they'll explain how the further back you go in the archaeological record, you see evidence of these civilizations 1,000, maybe 2,000 years before you see evidence of kings or aristocracy or palaces and stuff. And so even that timeline clarification sort of flips the whole equation upside down, you know?
Yeah, that's super helpful to kind of keep thinking about, because it's kind of abstract when you think about 2,000 years, right? Like, but then you like try and put that into context. It's like, well, that's like, modern recorded era of 2,000 years, and they're saying like some of these cities were around for like at least half of that amount of time, like previously. Like, it's a long time. We're coming up on 250, and that's not going so well for us right now.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of these cities and civilizations that they're talking about, 250 years is a blip in a lot of these things. Like what we were talking about last time with the two societies, the Neolithic and the Paleolithic on the steppe in the Middle East, and how there was the one matriarchal society and they lived in those communal houses for hundreds and hundreds of years that were just built on top of each other again and again, the same little communal formation. Like right there's like 4 U.S. history timelines into their one little communal civilization. Like the scale is astounding sometimes. Okay, more to the point of this whole abstract way of wrapping our heads around what a city is, on page 280 and 281, starting the bottom of 280, this paragraph, I'm just going to read these 3 paragraphs that conclude this section as a way for us to sort of talk about this as, I don't know, a thought experiment, thinking from the point of view of an individual, what is a city? They say it is as though modern forager societies exist simultaneously at 2 radically different scales, one small and intimate, the other spanning vast territories, even continents. This might seem odd, but from the perspective of cognitive science, it makes perfect sense. It's precisely this capacity to shift between scales that most obviously separates human social cognition from that of other primates. Apes may vie for affection or dominance, but any victory is temporary and open to being renegotiated. Nothing is imagined as eternal. Nothing is really imagined at all. That's kind of an assumption, but whatever. Humans tend to live simultaneously with the 150-odd people they know personally and inside imaginary structures shared by perhaps millions or even billions of other humans. Sometimes, as in the case of modern nations, these are imagined as being based on kin ties. Sometimes they are not. In this, at least, modern foragers are no different from modern city dwellers or ancient hunter-gatherers. We all have the capacity to feel bound to people we will probably never meet, to take part in a macro society which exists most of the time as virtual reality, a world of possible relationships with its own rules, roles, and structures that are held in the mind and recalled through the cognitive work of image-making and ritual. Foragers may sometimes exist in small groups, but they do not and probably have never lived in small-scale societies. None of which is to say that scale, in the sense of absolute population size, makes no difference at all. What it means is that these things do not necessarily matter in the seemingly common sense sort of way we tend to assume. On this particular point, at least, Kodie, who was a novelist they were talking about, had it right. Mass society exists in the mind before it becomes physical reality. And crucially, it also exists in the mind after it becomes physical reality. So when we say we are Americans, we are U.S. Americans, what is the imaginative work that has to go into that perception and that belief and that feeling?
Yeah, it's not just thinking like the connection, like it's some sort of shared bond or imagined shared bond, I guess, that kind of pops up during certain times. I don't know, like 4th of July or whatnot is probably when we think about it more, or after, after 9/11, like I feel like everyone had a much clearer sense of what American was, or felt like they did, right? They all felt like this more common attachment to being American probably at that point. Like it was a rallying thing. But yeah, I guess it's like it's an internal acknowledgement or internal, like your brain has to make that connection and decide that you're part of that group, right? I don't know if it's acknowledge you're part of the group or just agree with the assumption that's put on you because of where you're born or whatnot. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of where my head was going with that.
Yeah, I love this. It connects obviously like, to this first line about like cities beginning in the mind. It's about, I think of the mind, society's first a mental and moral experiment they kind of talk about a bit. And the mind precedes and outlives the city. Obviously, there's a lot of myth making involved in that. And we all share these communal myths and maybe like why the constitutions of like places can like outlive, like if like the temple falls, if the US, kind of collapses the political system, the Constitution still outlives us because the mental thought of our purpose in city and like maybe like telos, if we're talking about purpose there, outlives the actual structure and functionality of things. So it's like after physical forms crumble, the imaginary persists, I guess.
Yeah, that's an interesting take too, because it's like you're pointing out how important writing is and documentation in terms of being able to preserve a almost like a holographic copy of virtual reality. So like I think this whole thing, the thought that I'm having basically is that what we think of as virtual reality is not just a modern technological experience that some of us have, but it's something that's been going on for a very long time. That human beings have been living in virtual worlds and virtual communities that are just structures in their head that they share with one another across vast different distances. But what you're pointing out too, Arthur, is like the ability to document what those virtual realities look like, what the hierarchy is, what the structure is, what the organization is, allows the imagined piece to outlive the physical human beings that created it. If you can discover like a detailed city planning map of the lost city of Atlantis, you could recreate this fantasy world that no one has survived, right? It's just kind of interesting to think of it that way, that human beings have been living in virtual realities for millennia, potentially.
Definitely. It's kind of interesting too. Like they obviously draw a lot into like Plato and Aristotle, and because it's like the roots of, Greek, like a lot of our basis of logic, it literally like stems from the Greek, logic, whatever, logos. And like all of our maybe like blueprints of how capitalism and modern society live do stem from a lot of these Greek philosophers. So they're challenging a lot of that. And they talk a lot specifically about Plato in this. And I know in Plato's Republic, it's really like a blueprint of how to build the ideal city. And he talks about, well, Socrates talks about, and Plato writes, I guess, about like this imaginary city and how it would be perfect in the ideal form. And it starts in the mind, and it like, they project like this perfect order, which I forget the word they use, but it's like, the purpose of the Republic or the Calipolis or whatever they call the city is to have harmony and justice. Like justice is kind of like this harmonious, it's not like justice, it's more harmony of like order. And it kind of instills like a hierarchy. And then they kind of flip that and they're like, well, that's the problem, is like the mind is controlling like the blueprint of what the city ought be rather than like experiment with it, I guess.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. It immediately makes me think you have to get into the complexities of how actual city formation or actual civilization building is a reciprocal process between physical reality and virtual reality. You imagine a form, you construct something in reality physically, you renegotiate the process, you have communal decision-making processes where y'all talk about, are we imagining the same thing, first of all? Like, this is the whole metaphysical conundrum. Is your blue the same as my blue? What if we see different things when we say the word blue and we're not actually talking about the same thing, but on like a city planning scale? But yeah, it's a messy, complicated process. So you can see why consensus making and bodies of how people come together and make decisions together is a really, really important aspect of how all this stuff takes place.
Have you guys seen Civil War? It was like a more recent movie. I can't remember. I think it was
I know about it, but I never watched it, but I'm aware of it.
So like what you just said there, Joe, you're talking about like this, in our mind, are we seeing the same things? And you were asked earlier, like, what's this conception of like us, being American, right? Like, what do we view as that? There's a scene, and this is a minor spoiler, but in Civil War where there's this character, he's like a paramilitary character played by Jesse Plemons from, Breaking Bad. The guy played Todd from Breaking Bad. And he's like interrogating these people on like, they're like saying, yeah, we're American. He's like, oh, you're American. Like, what kind of American? And they're like, and he's like, where are you from? And it's like, Missouri. And he's like, well, yeah, that's American. Can't deny that. And the other person's like, Florida. He's like, oh, it's like Central American. Like, so like that whole like difference between like, what do you think is American versus like what other people think is American, and that conceptual idea, right? That is something that in theory should bring people together, can also be used to like rip, that fabric apart if you don't have the same view of what that actually means. So that was one thing I thought was, interesting for your virtual reality comment there.
Yeah, for sure. And like I've said before, that the whole concept of the United States as an entity has been used in a lot of different ways over the years, and a lot of those ways have been used to control people and get them to give up their other struggles that they were working on and get distracted by this other identity that, no, you should imagine us, we're all the same thing. But you got to have the right papers, you got to be born in the right place. If you complain about us too much, we're going to start taking away your rights. Like, I don't know, it gets really messy. On page 282, they drop this block quote by a sociologist called Claude Fisher. And I thought it was a cool little reflection on modern urban life along the lines of what we've been talking about. Of this quote, they say, Claude Fisher says, most city dwellers lead sensible, circumscribed lives, rarely going downtown, hardly know areas of the city they neither live nor work in, and see in any sociologically meaningful way only a tiny fraction of the city's population. Certainly they may on occasion during rush hours or football games, etc., be in the presence of thousands of strangers, but that does not necessarily have any direct effect on their personal lives. Urbanites live in small social worlds that touch but do not interpenetrate. So I thought that quote was interesting. It made me think about something else that they brought up in this book about ancient city-states like in Athens or Sparta, or how when a city-state would get sacked by another group, it would sometimes take days for people in other parts of the city to realize that their city had been overtaken. So what even is a city at that point? I feel like I've read or heard before that people who live in a city like New York or Philadelphia only encounter, 1,000 or 1,200 people total in their whole social circle, work lives, social lives, etc. And the rest of the million or millions of people in that city, they never have any encounters with at all. So what does it mean to live in the same city in that sense? It's just kind of a weird thing we're doing.
Yeah, I feel that too. It's like we're all adjacent, but maybe not relating all the time. And definitely, I think the theme that you're bringing up of virtual reality hits hard in that. It's like we're all consenting to live near each other in a proximate location, and we're all playing by the same rules. But if something happens and I don't know that person, or I do know that person, I'm going to react differently based off of my social code. It's just really interesting, the rules that get played out and how people relate to people in their city. And if you relate to the different classes in the city, how I would rank it, like some people drive by, like I've been in cities where they're pristine and there's homeless and people comment about like, oh, look at those people camping. So it's like, yeah, what is a city and like who belongs, I guess. And it's very like virtual reality. I don't know, pre-technology virtual reality. It's a really interesting thought to think about. I like that.
I guess, does that get stronger the further away you are from it? And what I mean by that is like, if you're traveling as an American and you go to some place and then you happen to see another American, like there might be a conversation started there. But like if you're in the US in your normal city, you're just going around your thing every day. But then all of a sudden you're like, I had a friend that was born in Chicago and we were in Baltimore and we're hanging out at, some bar or whatever. And then someone else comes up and they have a date with them that's also from Chicago. These two people don't know each other at all, but now they're having a 35-minute conversation about Chicago, right? And so like if they met each other in Chicago, like it wouldn't have been anything. But the fact that they're like, oh, we're both from here, like this, meeting and some other, they automatically have this like, I don't know, connection, right? That kind of plays into that. I don't really know where I'm going with that, but it's like playing into that thought.
That's such a good example too, because it's like the way that the virtual realities and the physical realities intersect on many different levels. Like you're saying, those people could have run into each other in Chicago and they would have just been strangers and never would have spoke. But because they run into each other in another city, they're two strangers who have this shared experience of a virtual reality of another place that's different from the place they're currently in. And so they get to talk about the shared virtual experience and have a meaningful, I don't know, it's human beings are weird. Like the way society works, the way we relate to each other on a social scale is like really, really weird. You can find these little moments of solidarity and identity in strange ways. Yeah, I know, it's almost like there are so many layers of virtual identity and reality on top of each other at the same time. And this is just another way to talk about the stratification of class and race and gender and occupation and expertise. There's so many different ways you could identify with other people and have shared experiences on a virtual level. But it gets, I don't know, human society is really messy and complicated and takes a lot of time to unpack and try to understand. I'm just kind of like eyebrows on the back of my head with the complexity of it all, I feel like.
Yeah. It seems like the stagnation of like maybe whatever the economic system people are in at the time can define the social logic. And I think for like capitalism, definitely like, it's alienation. It's like proximity and living close together without any sort of power and connection is the social logic of capitalism. It's like they've talked about this so many times about how like they try to divide us through an entire web of like ways, and we don't have any power, and we've lost that sense of, it's like, yeah, we all live close. It's been normalized. There's bureaucracy. We have no power and no experimentation ability left. Stagnation. Yeah.
I mentioned this, I think a while back. I can't remember what episode it was on or what we were doing, but that Adam Curtis documentary on Edward Bernays, there's like the way it starts and ends is it talks about how Edward Bernays at the World's Fair put together this model of what a future city could look like. And it was like, it was skyscrapers, and it was like this, the corporations take care of the people, and then the people buy, and then that feeds the corporations, this beautiful cycle and everything like that. And that was their vision of what a city would be like, and his like putting this out as this beautiful vision of the future. And then, like the way the documentary ends, just skip this if you're going to watch it because it is kind of interesting. At the end, it's like that entire thing that he built, he didn't believe in it at all. It was just commissioned by the corporation, so it was just all a big PR stunt like that he was doing at the time, which I just thought was so perfect and hilarious.
Yeah, that's really funny. I'm gonna have to watch that documentary. It sounds really, really good. Looking forward to that deep dive on that too. Yeah, part of where my head was at a second ago with what we're talking about is maybe we can talk about some of the different examples that they point to in this chapter of how community work got done, how decisions got made, how people were, because each one of these societies has very different setups, different ways that they made decisions and everything. And maybe one place to start, happy to go anywhere you guys feel like, but with the Mesopotamian cultures and the Sumerians, and maybe we're biased more towards this culture because there's writing that we can look at, that they can, they can talk about written records and stuff, so there's more to work with here. But this idea of corvée on page 299, which kind of ties in, I feel like, to conversations we've had about the draft for public works, sort of like getting everyone organized in a big public way to do some big community project like infrastructure stuff. But just reading about this corvée concept on 299, I'll just read the quick definition. They say this refers to obligatory labor on civic projects extracted from free citizens on a seasonal basis, and it has always been assumed to be a form of tax extracted by powerful rulers, taxes paid not in goods but in services. So you had like kings and farmers and soldiers and bakers all laying bricks together, like working on some big public project together. I thought that was an interesting concept. I don't know. We don't really have anything like that sort of just flattens all the hierarchy for a short period of time and gets everybody to work together.
I'd much prefer it. It's like if you could have like a assigned selection, you want to go do the crops, you want to go build the moat, whatever. Like I'd much prefer that than like, here's the money and like you guys bureaucrats go spend it how you want on 9 more aircraft carriers or whatever.
That would be an awesome alternative tax or something like that, where it's like 1 month of the year you're going to go work on this road crew, and then the rest of the time, like, that's your contribution to your local thing. Like, you don't need to pay taxes or town taxes, right? If you're going to do that. Unfortunately, that still favors people that just buy their way out of everything. But still, it would be interesting.
That's
concept.
so funny. Yeah, it would be like the rich are like, no, we don't want to work. Here's the money. Yeah,
That's okay. 90% tax rate.
Yeah. That what you said, Kodie, made me think about, I think last episode I talked about how there was this farming concept where you're supposed to farm 1 acre and leave 9 acres alone and just rotate every year. You could do the same thing with like the months and labor. Like everyone is obligated to 1 month of community labor a year, and then you get 11 months off to do whatever you want. And, we just keep it rotating on some sort of circular basis. Well, it's one of the society, they go back and forth in time a lot in this book. I don't know if you noticed that. They'll be talking about some ancient society, and then they'll be like, well, we don't really have enough evidence to know for sure what was going on here, so let's compare it to this modern thing that's not the same thing, but it gives us an idea of how it might have been. But they were talking about the Basque villages in the south of France and how they've had this sort of rotational, communal way of organizing mutual aid, just as an example of how to organize communal labor without hierarchy. It's all just become circle worshipers and worship the cycle, and everybody does their part in the rotation.
It's not mandatory, but there's, and maybe this ties into, I can't remember which city it was talking about in here, but the temporary city, mega city, if it was on some sort of seasonal basis or for some sort of religious festival or something like that. Then I guess like modern equivalent, like in Saranac Lake anyway, every winter they have the winter carnival where a bunch of people from town volunteer their time to go and build this ice palace, right? Where people come and like celebrate. Like, most people aren't getting paid for that. And that's like run by a committee that puts out who's going to do what things. And no one's like, making money off of that. So I don't know. There's a very small kind of comparison, but reminded me of that a little bit, I guess, in the way that gets organized. And
that's that's a great example. And like within your community, that's a nugget of potential to think about, or even to like start talking to people about how to expand that, as well as building this ice rink. Maybe we could do a little food distribution at the same time and start tying mutual aid to this whole thing. I think that's a beautiful example of the community coming together to do something not only fun, but useful for everybody. Like, yeah. Love that.
And it builds that same, I think, virtual reality of everyone being part of that and feeling like they're part of that community, right? That community identity, I guess.
It's like, they discuss somewhere there, like Mesopotamia, it's like the work like that. It's art, it's like building for art and community. And I guess where it like flips into administrative bureaucracy is when it's like the authority prescribes the work and it's like, no, you're not doing the winter festival. You're building the wall, and the wall is going to be 20 feet high. It's going to be our border. And it's like, what? And who gets to make that call? And it's, yeah. So I guess we need this corvée, but with the communal aspect, art building. That's kind of interesting that they go back to that. Like, it's been farming, city making, like it's all been, even customs and like how different tribes have lived so far in this book. It has been that it's like there's a clear distinction between like art and experimentation and like love of life, and then like cold bureaucracy and hierarchy and social consequence.
I know what I prefer.
Me too. As long as we're at the top of that city.
Yeah, I've said before that we need a much higher bar for what we accept as democracy. And they've got into that question a little bit in this chapter, and specifically talking about there's just sort of this ongoing myth or propaganda about Western culture, propagated by Western culture, that democracy was born in the West because of places like Athens and stuff. But something like, 40% of the population were slaves in Athens? And so you're talking about that as a birthplace of democracy. So we need a more clear definition and understanding what democracy is. But they talk about, looking at page 319 and 320, because they were talking about these Indus Valley civilizations and trying to connect them to later Indian civilizations and Buddhist culture, and they were talking about the Buddhist Sangha, which is the religious organization in Buddhist communities, and how they make decisions and come to agreements and stuff. And they say, process of consensus with a fallback to a majority vote. So in general, everything ought to be decided by unanimous decisions. You put everybody in the decision-making group, you all talk about it as a group, and you try your best to come to some unanimous decisions. And if unanimous decisions aren't possible, you fall back on a majority vote. And I thought that's just like a pretty simple, probably oversimplified, but clear definition of how actual democracy should work. Our problem is trying to figure out how to get 340 million people to come to some sort of unanimous decision or some majority vote.
I'm sure it was a Black Mirror episode where people like vote on their phones or something like that. I think it was like 100 million merits or something. But like, I guess like one of the benefits of technology, like we could do it. We absolutely could, right? Like we could have like almost everyone has a phone, right? At this point, like you could do a broadcast or a stream that pretty much anyone could gain access to. Like Wi-Fi is pretty well, at least in the United States, to allow people to, vote simultaneously. But we're not gonna.
Yeah, I mean, to like both those points, the stagnation and power is held by the group who is selecting who gets to vote there. And the whole Republican Party is like, stop mail-in voting. Let's have these like tests and like official cards and, whatever you need to vote. And then, you need to be state sanctioned. And it's essentially like, hey, let's just have all the white property owners make the decisions about white property being valuable and important. And that's...
Yeah. Stuff like that makes you question how much has really changed since 1770 or whatever. What you were saying made me think about ballot measures. Sometimes you'll have a ballot measure on your state. It's only a state, which is getting to my question. How come we don't get ballot measures at the federal level? You can, in your own state, that feels like about as big as they'll let it go. An individual state can be like, hey, gay marriage is cool. Marijuana is cool. We can do that. That's fine. Federal level, why don't we do that? Doesn't seem that hard.
It isn't. That's really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the classic is just states' rights, right? That's the argument that always comes back.
The scales get out of control because it's like, we're talking about cities in this chapter, but this is the same conversation just at different scales. A city is already so big that it has to be imaginary for it to work on some level. Same thing's true of a state. And it's already confusing because we're in the United States and we call states certain things, but everywhere else in the world, a state means a nation. So that term is already kind of confusing. But we can say individual states, that's already super big. Even a state like I grew up in South Carolina, which only has like 3 million people. Just conceptualizing that identity as a South Carolinian is already a hugely imaginary endeavor. I've never seen most of the state. I lived most of my life in a small part of it. I visited some other parts, but I don't know most of those people. I don't know what their lives are like. I don't know what they do, but I can vote with them on a ballot measure if I'm living in that state, and I'll come to a decision together. It's already the same thing at the national level. Right? It's huge. It's imaginary. You don't know most of the people, yet we're somehow identified together. So why can't we make some decision together? That's what I guess I mean by democracy. Is like, I'm less and less interested in the representative aspect of it, of choosing some arbitrary person who I also don't really know and just have to trust to make decisions on my behalf. Why can't we just make the decisions together as a group? Why can't we make votes on actual policy? Put a bill up in the House, have a national conversation about it, put it on a ballot measure for the whole country to decide on, and, let's see what happens.
Whoa. Yeah, I love that. It's, why can't we go back to this? Is it Sangha? Sangha? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, I think that's how most people say it.
It's like this imagined, you like talk until you agree and then go to like, unanimous vote, majority vote. And they talk in this chapter too about how the written form could have like started as like the minutes of meetings, and meetings being like the oldest, potentially like one of the oldest urban traditions and forms of coming to consensus, not monarchy at all and not representation. And how come, we can't go back to that?
I love that as a requirement for what a city is. A city is a group of people who has meetings and comes to decisions together. How about that? I like that. I like that definition a lot.
I did want to mention this, and I was going to bring it up at the end, but since you hit on scale, Joe, and something that they actually said pretty early on, but I think it's super relevant to what we get told a lot today. And this was on page 278, so pretty early in the chapter. It's right after it says, in which we first take on the notorious issue of scale. And what it's talking about is common sense and how common sense is kind of used in a certain way. So I'm just going to read the rest of that page from that point on. So common sense is a peculiar expression. Sometimes it means exactly what it seems to mean: practical wisdom born of real life experience, avoiding stupid, obvious pitfalls. This is what we mean when we say that a cartoon villain who puts a clearly marked self-destruct button on his doomsday device, or who fails to block the ventilation passages in his secret headquarters, is lacking common sense. On the other hand, it occasionally turns out that things which seem like simple common sense are in fact not. For a long time, it was considered almost universal common sense that women make poor soldiers. After all, it was noted women tend to be smaller and have less upper body strength. Then various military forces made the experiment and discovered that women also tend to be much better shots. Similarly, it is almost universal common sense that it's relatively easy for a small group to treat each other as equals and to come to decisions democratically, but that the larger the number of people involved, the more difficult this becomes. If you think about this, this isn't really as commonsensical as it seems, since it clearly isn't true of the groups that endure. Over time, any group of intimate friends, let alone a family, will eventually develop a complicated history that makes coming to agreement on almost anything difficult. Whereas the larger the group, the less likely it is to contain a significant proportion of people you specifically detest. But for various reasons, the problem of scale has now become a matter of simple common sense, not only to scholars, but almost to everyone else. So I thought, as we're talking about the scale and whatnot, that argument of I don't know how much you guys have heard that, it's just common sense, that's just such a talking point. The way that I took it from this paragraph is almost like it if we were flipping cards for from They Live, it would just be don't investigate, right? That's what common sense means.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And I think I still struggle with that as a common sense assumption. I think I've even said a version of that in this conversation already, that there's 340 million people in the US, and that scale feels like common sense, that it's difficult to make decisions together. I struggle with that assumption as well. I'm interested in challenging it and overturning it and coming to better solutions, but it does immediately feel like a impossible problem to solve just because of the scale, right? So, I mean, this is the thing about knowledge that I struggle with a lot, or just mull over a lot, is that you can know a thing and then also intuitively still be working against that thing that you know. I run into this a lot with teaching. It's one of the first things I noticed when I started teaching writing, is I would be saying things, giving my students advice about how to write, how to get over procrastination, how to develop their projects, how to work on their ideas. And as I'm talking, I started thinking, I'm not following any of this advice myself. I'm avoiding all of this writing advice that I'm giving my students. And this whole problem of knowing something and then putting it into practice for yourself, as a matter of habit, that is a sometimes difficult transition to make when you're processing new knowledge.
Definitely. And I think the way that they the example that they used there that definitely helped click for me was just that. Yeah, it intuitively seems like if you've got a small tribe of 20 people that'd be super easy, but that's making a huge assumption that those 20 people get along together. I don't know. I mean, I think one of the benefits of today's day and age is we are able to connect with people that we do get along with in much easier ways, that might not be physically close to us. But yeah, if you're stuck with 20 people, there's definitely going to be some personality conflicts,
Yeah, they mentioned how people would study modern hunter-gatherer groups, and there was this assumption initially that they're all part of the same genetic pool. They're all loosely related families and stuff, but when you actually do the genetic analysis, it turns out they come from very different places, vast distances that are separated, and just throughout history how common it is for people to get fed up with their kinfolk and travel vast distances to get away from them. And sort of the reverse of how that's developed in the modern era, that we travel less often than people used to, apparently. But because of technology, we're able to connect with virtual groups that are more in line with our interests. Meanwhile, we're just frustrated with the people around us, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. And then it was also made me think about those temporary, cities and stuff that they set up. It's like, was this why, right? Like, let's all meet for like, a few months and like, let's find our people. Right? Like,
Sounds awesome.
I don't know. Yeah.
It's like the first like festival Burning Man, But
Yeah.
let's all go do it for months. I'm ready to head to my like temporary coast city for a few,
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do some temporary cities and then go find find our tribes.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have anything you want to say about any of the other groups that they hit on here. There are 4 different groups, and they all have very different ways of doing things, and they all have interesting examples. I feel like we talked about the Mesopotamian one a little bit, and maybe the Buddhist Sangha with the Indus Valley civilization. They also had example of stratification with that one, like Mohenjo-Daro had like an upper level with a big communal bath and then a lower level. But yeah, are there any interesting little tidbits or factoids from any of these civilizations that just stood out to you as interesting or quirky or worth talking about?
Let me see which one this is. I think this is the Ukrainian mega cities. Yeah. The one spot that I wanted to highlight was on page 293, and it was talking about how basically they managed their ecosystem, that I thought was kind of interesting, because that's a question that I definitely had for myself, was like, okay, if you've got a temporary city of 20,000 people, how does that function, right? Like, because I was thinking about was it the Fire or the Fry Festival or something like that was put on? This was a couple years ago, and the guy that did it, like, basically did no logistics for it whatsoever. So there was like a bunch of people showed up. I'm pretty sure people died because of this. Anyway, that's what made me think about the logistics portion of
Fire Island. Take care. Wasn't an island, right?
Maybe that was what it was.
I think
sounds right.
Yeah. So anyway, so I wanted to read this portion here that kind of talks about how they did that. It's the second paragraph on page 293. So it said, we should also consider if the inhabitants of the megasites consciously manage their ecosystems to avoid large-scale deforestation. This is consistent with archaeological studies of their economy, which suggest a pattern of small-scale gardening often taking place within the bounds of the settlement, combined with keeping of livestock, cultivation of orchards, and wide-spectrum hunting and foraging activities. The diversity is actually remarkable, as is its sustainability. As well as wheat, barley, and pulses, the citizens' plant diet included apples, pears, cherries, sloes, acorns, hazelnuts, and apricots. Megasite dwellers were hunters of red deer, roe deer, and wild boar, as well as farmers and foresters. It was play farming on a grand scale, an urban populace supporting itself through small-scale cultivation and herding, combined with an extraordinary array of wild foods. So I just thought that was kind of awesome. Like, they come to this location that has, obviously it's got a lot of game, like, and it's like something that can support that way, but then they just supplement with all of these other, methods of play farming that they've talked about before. Just to, like, this was the one I think, like, that they eventually tear this whole thing down too, right? Was that this one? Yeah.
Yeah, where they like burn and rebuild or something. In the center, like, it's so interesting. Like I love this map. You know, it like, and they talk about how it's concentric rings, and it kind of looks like a tree trunk from bird's eye view, and how the center is like left empty. And they propose that it could be, or purport that it could be like for General Assembly, kind of meetings, or it could be other uses. And they expected to find like hierarchical, like, magnificent buildings or whatever. It's just empty land, and all the houses are pretty like uniform. They all have these gardens, and each few rings has like a kiln and it's just such a beautiful place. It's where we deserve to live.
Multiple assembly houses. Yeah.
As you were reading it, Kodie, I was just like, is my passport valid? Can I go live in this place wherever it is? Like, it just sounds like such a magical, perfectly balanced array of activities. There's all sorts of different things to do. It's not like this monotonous drudgery that you might imagine with communal living. There are so many different things to do. so many different foods to eat, and the whole empty space in the middle is just like ripe for imagination, right? We're sitting here, I don't know how many thousands of years in the future from when this place was populated, but we're having our own mad virtual reality experience with whatever was going on in this place. What were they doing in that middle area? If it didn't have monuments or palaces or anything like that, were they just playing around, having fun? Were they doing meetings? Were they planning things? You know, like, I don't know, there's just so many options there.
Group tag. It was a large game of tag every night. That would be so cool, though. It's really interesting too, like how each house like mirrors the next, and it's like I just thought about like I was like walking through the neighborhood, and it's like, well, each house is radically different, and each one signals like a difference in like, I don't know, class or money or whatever, and it's just so different. And now everybody's got a kiln. Everybody's got Did
you guys watch the TV show Weeds?
I did, yeah.
Remember the title sequence, the song from the title sequence? Little
Something about houses.
on
Yeah,
the
yeah.
hillside, little houses made of ticky-tacky, and they're all just built the same. Just monotony in a different way. Like the monotony we see here with some of these ancient sites with their copy houses. That's one kind of thing that causes a certain pattern to go over and over again. But like when you think about the modern subdivision and all these perfect little houses that get plopped down, that's a totally different reason. I don't know, it just struck me as you were talking about that, the different ways, the different causes, I guess, for monotony in buildings. Like there's something beautiful about one kind that we're talking about, and then there's something kind of creepy and sinister about the modern kind. I just kind of wanted to think about that difference a little bit between those.
Well, what I think about immediately is what we talked about when you were showing that picture, Arthur, is like there's these communal spaces where we can just imagine people coming together and gathering. They have assembly houses, like they clearly are working together in order for this whole, experiment to survive and everything. But then you think about what came to my head was I think it's vivarium, but like just a modern townhouse, just rows and rows of houses, right? Like, and maybe they have a couple communal spaces, which are like the little playgrounds, right, that are put in there for the kids. But in general, it's like each one of these domiciles is where you and your family are going to be locked away with everything you need to survive, right? It's less of like a come together type thing than it is a, I don't know, jail isn't right, but that kind of feeling, almost like it's locking you in.
Yeah. It's like instead of like we could all live in the third ring, and maybe we, Joe's got the oven and we come over and we do the communal stuff, whatever. And now it's like we're all siloed and independent, and isn't that convenient?
Yeah, that's true. I think that maybe that's the creepiest thing about our modern neighborhood setup is just how little we know our neighbors. I'm familiar with my neighbors. I know their faces and their names. I wave when I see them and stuff, but we don't really live in community together. You know what I mean? Like, we don't produce food together. We don't take care of our basic needs together. I feel like these people were doing shit together every day. That's one aspect we're missing in the modern city.
I would say though, like, not the smaller the town, I mean, maybe, and again, it's weird because it's coming back to the scale thing, but like it is true. I feel like in some small towns, like that you've got more of that sense of community. When we lived down in Maryland, I think we were in like Odenton or something, which I mean, I couldn't tell you Odenton versus like the next town over, like Severn, like, what the difference is. Like, I feel like, it all feels like it kind of just merges together in some ways. Whereas like, up here, at least there's definitive towns, right? Villages, I guess. I don't know if that makes any difference, but it feels like it does.
Yeah, I feel like you're pointing something out about like, it's not urban sprawl, it'd be more like suburban sprawl of how you can have, there are no definitive wilderness areas in between the townships, right? It's just more strip mall, more strip mall, more strip mall. The farther you go, it's just that there's pictures online, there are memes now of like, where's this from? And it's just a picture of an average American street with a car dealership and a McDonald's and a Target, and name all the brands you can think of. But it looks like every other place in the country that everyone's familiar with. And there's something, there's a violence there. I can't really explain it clearly enough, but I can feel it. There's a certain violence that it's done to human society that is not good. Yeah.
And on the flip side of that, when you have a picture of a place like Church Street in Burlington, like anyone that's been there would be like, oh, I know exactly where that is. That's like the downtown area where everyone goes, and like all the restaurants and shops and where everyone would meet, right? And like it's a walking street, so there's no cars that go up and down it, so it just brings more people to that spot. And like any area that has that kind of recognizable downtown cultural center that brings people kind of together, like, I guess that's the flip side in my head. That does exist, right?
Yeah, more of that for sure. The only other thing that I really wanted to talk about was the last civilization that they kind of just drop in there at the end. First example of a city revolution, maybe, in prehistory. The Chinese civilization, Taosi? I don't know how to say it. What do you guys think about this?
Oh, yeah. I think it's 325. I highlighted something. They say, where is it here? Taosi. Oh, yeah, it's right under it. Anyway, they say at the site of Taosi, contemporary with Shimao, but located far to the south of the Jinan Basin, we find a rather different story. Between 2300 and 1800 BC, Taosi went through 3 phases of expansion. First, a fortified town of 60 hectares arose on the ruins of a village, expanding subsequently to a city of 300. In these early and middle periods, Taosi presents evidence for social stratification almost as dramatic as what we see in Shimao, or indeed what we might expect of a later imperial Chinese capital. These were massive enclosure walls, road systems, and large protected storage areas, also rigid segregation between commoner and elite quarters with craft workshops and a calendrical monument clustered around what was most likely some sort of palace. And then it goes on about how like the burials in the early town cemetery fell into clear, distinct social classes. And then suddenly around like 2000 BC, they say everything changes. The city wall was raised flat and the original functional divisions destroyed, resulting in a lack of spatial regulation.
No, that's great. Like, yeah, what we were just reading from is the excavator notes. They're quoting from what the excavator of the site wrote down when they excavated it. And I thought this little snapshot into the work of archaeology was kind of interesting. You can just sort of imagine someone at a site digging things up and taking notes as they go and stuff. I'll just continue reading where you left off, Arthur, with these excavator notes. The city was raised flat and the original functional divisions destroyed, resulting in a lack of spatial regulation. Commoners' residential areas now covered almost the entire site, even reaching beyond the boundaries of the middle period large city wall. The size of the city became even larger, reaching a total area of 300 hectares. In addition, the ritual area in the south was abandoned. The former palace area now included a poor-quality rammed earth foundation of about 2,000 square meters, surrounded by trash pits used by relatively low-status people. Stone tool workshops occupied what had been the lower-level elite residential area. The city clearly had lost its status as a capital and was in a state of anarchy. So that's the end of the excavators' notes. And maybe I'll just continue reading the rest of this because I feel like their reflections on these excavator notes are kind of interesting. It might give us something to talk about to wrap up the episode. So the authors of the book now say, what's more, there are clues that this was a conscious process of transformation, most likely involving a significant degree of violence. Commoner graves burst in on the elite cemetery, and in the palace district, a mass burial with signs of torture and grotesque violations of the corpses appears to be evidence for what the excavator describes as an act of political retribution. Now, it is considered bad form to question an excavator's first-hand judgment about a site, but we cannot resist a couple of observations. First, the ostensible state of anarchy, elsewhere described as collapse and chaos, lasted for a considerable period of time, between 2 and 3 centuries, longer than the history of the United States. Second, the overall size of Taosi during the latter period actually grew from 280 to 300 hectares. This sounds a lot less like collapse than an age of widespread prosperity following the abolition of a rigid class system. This suggests that after the destruction of the palace, people did not fall into a Hobbesian war of all against all, but simply got on with their lives, presumably under what they considered a more equitable system of local self-governance. Here on the banks of the Fen River, we might conceivably be in the presence of evidence of the world's first documented social revolution, or at least the first in an urban setting. Other interpretations are no doubt possible, but at the very least, the case of Taosi invites us to consider the world's earliest cities as places of self-conscious social experimentation, where very different visions of what a city could be like might clash, sometimes peacefully, sometimes erupting in bursts of extraordinary violence. Increasing the number of people living in one place may vastly increase the range of social possibilities, but in no sense does it predetermine which of those possibilities will ultimately be realized. As we'll see in the next chapter, the history of central Mexico suggests that the kinds of revolution we've been talking about, urban revolutions of the political kind, may well be a lot more common in human history than we tend to think. Again, we may never be able to fully reconstruct the unwritten constitutions of the earliest cities to appear in various parts of the world, or the reforms undergone in their first centuries, but we can no longer doubt that these existed. Revolution, baby! Let's go!
Yeah, I love this like Taosi, well, maybe not the first, but at least a great prime example of like they had all the things that the state called for traditionally. They had the walls, they had the hierarchy, and then they just walk away from it. That's pretty sweet.
What I was thinking about as you were kind of walking through that, Joe, is how I guess like cities continue, life continues during like conflict and war, right? Like you've got like Ukraine that's completely at war with another country and some not having all of the same level of support from their centralized government, right? Because they're focused on something else at the moment. But life kind of continues on. I guess I'm trying to think of what would be the modern equivalent of a city that just is like, you know what, we're just going to get rid of the ruling class completely and we're just going to kind of continue to run ourselves, right? Like, so I guess there are still examples of life going on despite not having the same level of hierarchy authority over you, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's what would naturally happen too if a collapse of an empire happened. Like, yes, we'd all just kind of organize and get on like how we have been doing. And it would probably be a lot more communal. Like we'd be in our respective states or whatever, and I'm sure the communities would form and it wouldn't be this Hobbesian, like, we're all just brutish and these like movies that they produce, Hollywood like produce these like just without, a ruling class, you're just all at war with each other and you're all going to die in a firebomb. It's like, no.
It's like the picture of everybody, like there's going to be warlords immediately, right? Like,
Yeah.
like
That's so funny.
the wastes of central U.S. is just going to be like the warlord of South Dakota or something.
Yeah, I mean, that for me, that's like the form of propaganda that I think is the most insidious in our world right now. Is just this, I don't know, like they've almost colonized our imagination when it comes to alternative possibilities. Like we just assume that if it's not this, it's got to be just total chaos and destitution and everyone's desperate and dying and disease and everything. And we have all these shows we can all talk about that depict this. Like they build the world for us. They not only make us afraid of it, but they build it and produce it and depict it and then get us to think that that is our main source of entertainment. So we all binge watch The Walking Dead and imagine how terrible the world would be if it all fell apart. But like the alternative is that it's actually kind of boring and normal and people will just grow food and hang out and carry on and it won't be that big of a deal. I remember recently reading about I think it was 1919. I was going to look it up in the People's History of the United States, but it was about the Seattle General Strike. In 1919 or the early 20th century, there was like a 5-day general strike in Seattle. And government officials and stuff were struggling to come up with a narrative that depicted it as bad because there was no violence. Everyone had really carefully organized mutual aid. People just didn't go to work, but everyone was chill and happy. And crime statistically actually went down during that period of the general strike. And so they were just scrambling how to depict this as a bad thing, but it was actually just a very kind of boring, beautiful thing where people just took care of each other and carried on with their lives. Yeah, it is possible. It does still happen. Cities are imaginary. The people are real. You can change your imagination about them and carry on and do new things together. I don't know. It's an exciting time to live. But I'm looking forward to the next chapter, chapter 9. What is it? The title. They always have good titles, I feel like, or try to make them interesting. Yeah. Chapter
They
9 is
definitely do.
titled Hiding in Plain Sight: The Indigenous Origins of Social Housing and Democracy in the Americas. And there's a really good anecdote in that chapter about Cortez and the Aztec Empire. Was it the Aztec in central Mexico? Maybe I'm wrong about that. But Cortez had a problem trying to overthrow that empire, and he needed the help of another local group to do it. And I'm looking forward to talking about that dynamic. I won't spoil it, but it's a really good little tidbit. So stay tuned for next time when we continue our journey with the dawn of everything. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.